Where Did the Road Go is made possible in part from our Patreons. And this month, Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by Allison Cook, Eric Hervin, and Super Inframan. If you'd like to help us out and support the show, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now tonight's show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And I am happy to welcome back Mr. Brent Raynes. How are you doing, Brent?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing okay, yeah. I finished... I have you back. We talked about a month ago about your John Keel book, The Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing Mysteries. And this is going to be the second part to that, because there was a lot of stuff in here. I highly recommend this book. If you're at all interested in John Keel, and even if you're not that interested in John Keel, you go off in a lot of different directions on here that are kind of spawned by some of John Keel's ideas, but you're not just talking about John Keel. This isn't like a biography of Keel. It's more an exploration and a furthering of some of his ideas.
Right. There was, he influenced so many people in the field, and myself included, at an early age. And so I documented from my own ongoing studies, and I interviewed people that he had worked with, that he had influenced in the field. And it's not just a biography of John Keel, but it's quite a bit more. And hopefully it gives someone ideas for their own research efforts, their own investigative work. If they're interested in pursuing this further, they can see how the different areas that can be explored, and that a lot of times researchers get into a certain point where, I know, like when I got into this field, and at 14 back in 67, I was simply looking at the mainstream perspective of ufology, that it was ET based, nuts and bolts, and I wasn't looking any further. And then, because of Keel's writings, I began to take an interest in what he was looking at, the wider perspective of potentially interrelated phenomena, the paranormal, because Keel thought ufology should be a branch of the parapsychology, and so much more, really. And so I began corresponding with him myself back in October of 1969, and we had quite an extensive correspondence there for the first 2 years until I got out of high school and got in the Navy, and there was a little disruption. But after I got out, we got back together again in our correspondence. But he certainly, he and Jacques Vallée, as you and I have discussed just before the program, are two people who influenced me, as they have you, in your own interest and perspective in all of this.
Yeah. They were definitely way ahead of their time on a lot of this stuff. I mean, more people are now coming around to the idea that this stuff is all one thing or interconnected. But back then, that was like anathema.
Yeah, and back then it was very difficult for John Keel to get across what he wanted to communicate to the UFO mainstream, and he was getting a lot of criticism. There was even people who accused him of making these stories up, that some wanted to know how much he paid the people in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, to make up these Mothman stories and such. I think some people got phone calls making inquiries into stuff like that. But anyway, I can assure you that wasn't the case.
And he didn't really think that much of the Mothman thing. Like, he kind of wrote some articles about it and walked away from it, didn't he? And then he was asked to write a book about it, and that's what kind of pushed that back into the spotlight. Yeah,
he in 1966, he he'd had a book that sold really well. He had some money, and he had been down to Ivan Sanderson's in New Jersey, had seen a UFO with Ivan Sanderson, some others, and had an interest in the subject for some time. And there was this huge wave going on back then of sightings. And so he got an offer from Playboy to write an article. And he even went to the Pentagon and spent about 2 hours talking with an official who told him there was nothing to it, make better use of your time. And he told the guy that, I know there's something to it. I saw one of these things myself. I'm sure he was referring to the dome disc he saw back in 1954 over in Egypt, hovering over a dam over there. So he decided to, for a while, for several years there, to become actively involved full-time in investigating this. And he had extensive correspondence with many people in the field. He traveled through 20 states, interviewing witnesses. He found that Point Pleasant, West Virginia, seemed to be a location that offered perhaps the best advantage. The activity that was going on was very heavy, and he would locate positions on hilltops where he could get a good view of the surrounding landscape and would see these lights himself. And in fact, on April 3rd, 1967, early in the morning, he had a sighting that was quite close. It was a dome disc-type object, flew by his car. It really shook him up. He locked all the doors. It seemed to land in a ravine nearby. And so for about 3 years, I think, and he was very active. And then he also had other interests, and he redirected some of that to other areas, and kind of left the thing alone towards I guess 1973 or so. He still put out an occasional article, and he wrote a newsletter that he distributed among people in the UFO field called Anomaly, which was put out periodically, and he would only ask that people send a stamped, self-addressed envelope to receive the next copy. And anyway, at the time, there was a literary agent who suggested that it would, she thought he should write a book on his investigations at Point Pleasant, the story about the so-called Mothman. And so he had all this material in a suitcase in his closet, and he pulled it out, and he pulled out all his clippings and his notepads and affidavits and things, and constructed a book rather reluctantly that he came to call the Mothman Prophecies. And he was disappointed in the turnout. He said it didn't really sell that well. Of course, eventually when the movie came out in 2002 by the same title, The Mothman Prophecies, with with
Richard Gere.
Let's see, Richard Gere. Yes, I kept thinking Gene something. I must have been thinking of Gene Steinberg. Anyway, Richard Gere. Which he said he was better looking than Richard Gere. But anyway, that movie helped quite a bit. He gave him a little money in his pocket there, and the Mothman Prophecies got reprinted, I think, into several different languages, even overseas. So it was, things were looking up at that point. But anyway, he was, what can I say, he had lots and lots of different interests. He worked for a while in Washington, D.C. for the Library of Congress as a kind of a technical advisor, and he worked at many other different jobs. Worked for people in the media, in TV appearances. He was a head writer for Merv Griffin and people like Gene Rayburn. And back in the 50s, I mean, he was drafted into the Army, and he really got his big start in being a journalist, working with the American Forces Network in Frankfurt, Germany, back in the 50s. And he also became a foreign radio correspondent, in places like Paris and Berlin and Rome and Egypt. And in 59 and 60, he was a science editor for Funk and Wagnall encyclopedias. So, I mean, there's just he was he got quite well established as a photojournalist, and this UFO thing came along in '66, and he had already had 2 sightings before, so he had this, well, more than that actually, I guess about 3. So his interest was quite piqued by the activity of '66, and he had some money in his pocket from a book that sold quite well back then that was unrelated to UFOs. It was just a kind of a novel. It was a comical thing. He wrote a lot of comedy, and it was about a spy, kind of like a James Bond type spy, and all the women just fell all over him, you know. But anyway, he also had an interest in reptiles and snakes. His apartment actually had these aquariums with snakes in them, which some people thought rather weird in, New York City. But he had a honorary PhD in herpetology. He got interested in snakes and reptiles back when he was a young boy, and he also got an honorary PhD in archaeology. And even though he ran off to New York City when he was only 17 with 75 cents in his pocket, hitchhiked, I think, a little over 200 miles.
Yeah, from up by Buffalo, right?
Yeah, by Buffalo. He had been since age 14. He had impressed an editor of up in Perry, New York, the Perry Herald, with his writing, and he wrote a weekly column called Scraping the Keel, which involved a lot of humorous things. I don't know what all he wrote, probably, local things, politics and community news and such. But anyway, he got $2 a week for writing the column. And I guess back then, that would have been about 1944. I guess that was pretty good change.
Yeah.
Things were cheaper back in them days.
Right.
So he decided that's what he wanted to do, and when he headed off to New York City, he was going to become a writer, make his mark on the literary world. But he always had an interest in magic. He actually, earlier on, he thought he would become a stage magician. And I understand he did have a manuscript that involved all kinds of magic tricks, some that he had invented himself. And he was respected by people in the community there. There was a Ben Robinson, considered by the New York Times as a master magician, who has a website that has a write-up he wrote back when the Mothman Prophecies, the movie, came out, and he was saying a lot of great complimentary things of Keel in that feature. But anyway. So anyway, where do we go from here?
Well, there's a bunch of stuff you talk about in the book that I find really fascinating. Let's start with this one, because I guess I vaguely heard of this before, but I don't think I ever paid that much attention. You talk about how a lot of things, like when people hear voices or see something, it's often on the left side.
Yeah, I had found this. There was a lady that I met in Florida back in 1973, Ramona Clark. She later became Ramona Hibner. But I had written to her going back to 72, and we finally met when I was in the Navy. I was at the time, and that's how I happened to be in Florida. I'm originally from Maine. And she had told me, this whole story about the experience that she and her naval husband and their 13-year-old son had of seeing a dome disc-shaped object, and they actually drove underneath it. And within about 3 or 4 days after that experience, in July 1967, their home became host to a poltergeist disruption. There'd be footsteps and knocking sounds, different odors, and there would be this male voice calling her name, She might be inside the house, or she might be outside the flower garden, but it would always be just behind her left ear. And I didn't think too much about it, but then I came across these other instances, like Arago, the Brazilian healer that John Fuller wrote an article about, and it was studied by Andrea Puharich, who studied many psychics over the years. And he would claim that he was given this healing ability by this spirit doctor who would speak to him through his left ear. There was a British medium named Leslie Flint who would hear voices above his head and off to the left side, estimated that it was maybe about 2 foot distance from him. Excuse me. There was a Colin Parsons who wrote a book called Encounters with the Unknown, and he was documenting how for 30 years he would hear this whispering voice giving messages into his left ear and telling him things that were impossible. At first he tried to ignore it. Nobody wants to admit I'm hearing voices.
Yeah.
But it eventually told him that he didn't need to take this business trip to this foreign country. And what I remember, it's in my book, is that there was an earthquake in the place that he was going. Mm-hmm. So then he began to take the voice a little more seriously. And as I read up on this a little more, I found out, that there was this Dr. Nanda Forder, who was a New York psychoanalyst, who wrote a book that was published back in '66 called An Encyclopedia of Psychic Science. And he noticed that many mediums would be, when they were in trance, they would have like this hemispheric brain shift. And say ordinarily they would be right-handed, but when they were in trance, they'd be left-handed. And there was a back in the 70s, there was a Brian Scott who, out in Garden Grove, California, a contactee, abductee, who was going into these trance states and having missing time and different things where people claimed were going on in his house, balls of light. And when he was one time witnessed in a trance state, he was doing this automatic writing. And his face was described as becoming a dull gray, very unnatural dull gray, and his eyes were focused on the wall in front of him. But meanwhile, his hand was just writing away, except it was noticed it was his left hand instead of, the fact that he was right-handed. And John Keel felt that it was scandalous to him that the only full-scale psychological study ever done of a contactee, he said at the time that he wrote this was back in the 1890s, a medium who was known as Helene Smith, and she was studied by a Swiss psychologist named Theodore Fournoy by the University of Geneva. And she was one of these people that when she was in trance, she would suddenly look for her pocket on the left side instead of where it was on the right side. And they even, this doctor even would divide her perception of what was going on, her hand behind a screen where she couldn't see what was going on. And he would pinch a finger and it would be the opposite hand, the finger on the opposite hand that would become agitated. And so she seemed to have the same thing going on. And Keel was interested. He found that he was dealing with more left-handed contactees than right, which shouldn't happen. And I know that Ramona, she was right-handed, but she said they made her switch when she was a child. Otherwise, she might have been grown up left-handed.
Well, I mean, and that fits too with that the right side of the brain is the creative part, and that controls the left side of the body. And that kind of fits into what might be going on here a little bit. Like there's some creative co-creation element here, and so maybe people who are stronger on that brain hemisphere, are more prone to this phenomena.
Right. It's a lot of your parapsychologists have felt that it's a lot of the paranormal stuff that gets your ESP or telepathy or precognitive abilities, maybe channeling through the right brain, the non-dominant part of the brain as we think of it, and so all of this kind of led me to notice something back in 2009. When I was interviewing two different experiencers, I noticed something that I thought was interesting. So I'll tell you about it. It's in the book.
Okay.
There was one guy here in Tennessee. He and his wife had just had a classic flying saucer sighting up in Spring Hill. And as I was interviewing about any past experiences he had, he described this one in Cherry Creek, New York. He was deer hunting, and suddenly he sees this deer about 50 yards away, he estimates. And the next thing he knows, instead of a deer, it's a person in a very tight-fitting, shiny suit, silver. And then there's this, it raises its hand, and there's a silver ball, and suddenly this ball suddenly goes from this person, shoots across, and it's suddenly in his face about 6 to 8 inches at eye level, golf ball-sized silver sphere, and it's just hovering there, and then next he's unconscious, he's picking himself up off the ground like he'd just fallen asleep. And he'd had experiences of like seeing ghosts, spirits, and he finds when something like this happens, and he'll sometimes give messages to people, that his left hand will shake uncontrollably, has a tremor like, and it also gets kind of hard for him to breathe. Now he's right-handed, although he has a twin brother who's had experiences who's left-handed. And then earlier that year, I had met a gentleman by the name of Johnny Sands. He's a country singer, a stunt man, and I had met him up near Nashville, thanks to Timothy Beckley. And he had an experience outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, back in '76. And he'd seen this, he described seeing a grapefruit-sized silver sphere, and he was demonstrating to me how this being from a UFO held this sphere, and it was in his left hand. And I asked him, was it in his left hand as you're demonstrating? And he said, yes. And, because I've been noticing about this left-right stuff for some time. Mm-hmm. And he said it grew to be the size of a basketball, and then it just sort of hovered there, and it began to rotate. And he put a hand over the top of it, this being, and he noticed these kind of like firecracker type disruptions on the top of this globe. And he gave him the being gave this Johnny Sands this explanation about nuclear explosions are causing a problem on the in the solar system, and this could affect us and them.
Right.
Kind of, classic contactee message, please stop. And yet we also have a book out now that lists all kinds of cases of UFO sightings around nuclear power plants too.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a pretty strong theme, but and in this case he had kind of MIB type encounters too, and I noticed again these characters were left-handed. So
well, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that so curious about that, I began to do some research, and I had some copies of different magazines I went through. One of them was Flying Saucer Review in England, and I just started going through this, and I came across two stories of alien encounters in Argentina, where an object, in one case that would shoot light beams, was being held in the left hand, and another one also had a white glow to it and was billiard ball sized, held again by an alien being. And then a case in Finland where there were two skiers who saw this being. It's quite a well-known case. What isn't so well known is that one of the experiences later claimed that he had two visits from this woman in a tight-fitting dress, glittery dress, with who held in her left hand a silver ball, and she could like float in the air. Some of the she said her appearance was quite unusual, but she was quite beautiful, fair skin, blue eyes. And at the end, she just seemed to float away and disappeared. He had two encounters with this woman. And back in May of last year, I was watching Ancient Aliens, and it had a gentleman on there from Tennessee who appears on the show quite often, William Henry, the investigative mythologist. Mm-hmm. And he was showing two pictures, two paintings that had been done. One was supposed to be Leonardo da Vinci back around 1513, of Christ with a sphere in his left hand, and then another one, 14th century, a Buddha figure with a sphere in its left hand. And you know, he had no mention of the fact the left hand. He was interpreting these as this thing the Buddhists had called Chimta Mun Eye, which appears in some of their artwork and stuff. It's supposed to be this orb type thing that brings the powers of heaven, or the powers of the universe, to Earth. And William Henry, I contacted him. He simply called them the orb handlers or holders, and so I began to research, on the internet, and I found there was quite a few figures of Christ holding this sphere, and they were often in the left hand, seen more than the right hand from what I was looking at. So I haven't pursued that any further, but it's just seems kind of intriguing there,
Yeah.
What is this object?
Huh.
So
that was not something I was familiar with at all.
But it'd be quite interesting if they could, I have spoken about this for years. If only we could get some researchers who could do brain scans of experiences when they were presumably channeling things, or they were in hypnosis, or they were talking about it, recalling the experience. Because I know there are people I've heard of. One even communicated to me. He was a college professor who had an encounter with his son, and a series of other encounters, but with these beings. And he noticed that the encounter with his son he had this mark on his red, round mark on his neck. And it went away, but whenever he thinks a lot about his experiences, the mark will temporarily come back. And I've heard of this in other situations too. And so I thought, wow, if only, I know it, very expensive thing, and most people would have to get a grant in order to do this. But if we could have someone who was doing this, and then I found out earlier this year that there is someone doing this. It was back on November 30th of last year, so it's almost a year ago. There were two researchers, Christopher Kit Green and Gary Nolan, who two distinguished medical doctors who were doing a talk at Harvard Medical School about people who are having like UAP orb encounters, and they were doing MRI studies of the brain. Excuse me. And eventually this is going to end up in a journal. I've been in contact with Gary Nolan, and they're looking at a certain area of the brain that they think may be sensitive to these energies, because they've got one group that of a little over 100 people in the survey where they have medical records, they've done MRIs, and they find there's an area of the brain that seems to have an increased neural connection. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's what they call a caudate putamen. And some other parapsychologists have looked at that area of the brain too in the past as being somehow significant to, being able to perceive things at the psychic level. And and it's located kind of, I think, like just sort of below the hemispheres of the brain. So I think there's a connection there too. But I would love to see, finally somebody's actually doing this, and I'd love to, that they actually eventually publish their results on their studies. Now, Kit Green was involved back in '72 with the CIA when he was assigned to being a handler for a lot of the researchers and the psychics, like Pat Bryce and Ingo Swann and Uri Geller, and working with Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ.
Right.
And he was a skeptic in the beginning, but what really got him interested in looking at this UFO thing was with Uri Geller. I'm sure this is what it was. He was, in fact, a good book to read is Phenomena by Annie Jacobson, who went around and interviewed Kit Green and Hal Puthoff and Targ and others who were from those early days involved in the Stanford Research Institute's parapsychological studies, the remote viewing and psychokinesis. But Uri Geller was asked at the Lawrence Livermore Nuclear Lab to come in and do a series of psychokinesis experiments back in late 74. And Kit Green was monitoring it from Langley. And all of a sudden, while this was going on, these scientists, nuclear engineers who were working at this lab, were coming in into work, reporting that a lot of strange things were happening at their home. And so Kit Green was contacted. They said they were actually traumatized. Some of them, two of them, were actually threatening to quit, and they were seeing orbs of light. One scientist and his wife, I think, in their bedrooms, saw this arm with a hook on the end floating above their bed, and another man saw like these tall, dark, bird-like figures walking through shrubbery or something around his house.
Right.
So it got pretty strange. And then on top of that, they captured like an EVP during one experiment, and Kit Green listened to it and heard a top secret code name that he was sure that none of the scientists were familiar with, but it concerned him because, there it was on audio.
Yeah.
And they weren't supposed to know about this. So, and I know that Gary Nolan, I listened to an interview that he did, mentioned that there were two remote viewers who they had in their project who were had this higher density neuronal connection in that part of the brain as these other people they were studying. So it's just quite intriguing. They said it was like an antenna, maybe to psychic frequencies or whatever.
Yeah. That was really interesting.
Yeah, it all of this, I think, just gives us maybe a little more to work with. Sometimes I wonder if I'm connecting all the dots right or not, but I know that in the forward to my book, Rosemary Guiley, who, she became a good friend of Keel's, and she had a lot of experiences herself and came to similar conclusions he did. She said that Keel was always thinking about how people were, a lot of these experiences were kind of wired differently, as she expressed it, and had like an antenna to these other alternate realities. But she said he never said this of himself, but she highly suspected, as do I, that this was the case, that he was also one of these people, and that helped him to catch on quicker to when he started studying this, because in '66 he began to, in his writing and his research, he was looking at ET, and by the following year, after he began to interview people, he started writing about how the paranormal was involved and everything, and quickly came to a lot of alternative conclusions that the mainstream wasn't happy with at the time. And so it goes.
Yeah. Let's talk about Men in Black. You mentioned them a bit. This was one of the big things Keel tended to research, and it's one of the few things I've never been quite sure what to make of.
Yeah, and it's it was a lot of reports back in the '60s, and Keel probably would have, I'm guessing, had maybe not paid that much attention to it himself had it not been that he had found himself visiting experiences, witnesses, and being told that just a few minutes earlier there were these MIB types that had been at their door warning them, threatening them not to talk about this. And he also said that he received a call one time, and there was a location that had a lot of activity out on Long Island called Mount Misery, near a place called High Point. And he went out there, he got a phone call and was told to come there. He did, and there was one of these black Cadillacs that the so-called Men in Black were often seen driving, and there were two gentlemen in the front, one driver and one guy in the passenger seat, who looked very much like your typical MIB, the black suits, the sunglasses. Mm-hmm. And he started to get out of the car to come up to them, and they started to drive off. So he jumped back in his car, followed them down this winding road, and eventually came around a corner, and there was a dead end, but, there was no black car. And he was quite mystified by that, So yeah. He felt it was a demonstration for him to realize that his experiences were telling the truth, in case he had any doubts. At least some of them.
Yeah.
But in my book, I try to give a little background. Keel felt that there was different kind of MIB type episodes. There was some that were some kind of projections. Maybe they were intense visionary, or maybe they were like a tulpa, a thought form,
right?
An apparitional thing. And then sometimes there might be people who are being controlled, manipulated to play these roles. And he even thought, maybe they were like possessed by this interactive intelligence. And he actually wanted to, he knew he wasn't going to be able to find a landed saucer with little men and, grapple with them and get them to tell him the truth. So he thought if he could eventually catch up with the MIB and find out the story there, that would be his best approach. So he kept on the lookout, and was hoping one day he would, but as far as I know, he never did catch the little rascals driving around in their black Cadillacs. But there are still a lot of stories. I mean, I was following up on a case in a foreign country recently, and the guy really doesn't want any publicity, and he said that there was MIB type activity going on after he had this sighting with some other scientists. I mean, these are scientists, and they'd seen craft, and immediately after he started talking about it, and these two men came to this university and dressed in black and very light skin, white hair, but he continued to pursue it. And one day he's in another location, and he's warned by this this woman dressed like these guys, similar appearance, and he manages to, he goes it's in a restaurant. He goes into a bathroom and snaps a picture from the bathroom door, and he did send me the picture, but it's like he described, but you can't identify anybody from this. But we had a number of exchanges in the over the internet about this situation. There's a lot of activity going on in his country. I wanted to do an interview with him about his sighting, and I discovered about this MIB activity. So they're still around. There's apparently.
But that was a UFO conference that he took that picture at, right?
Well, no, actually, he had just done a talk. I don't think it was a conference. He did some radio shows, that he wanted to.
But it was a UFO-related event.
Right. And this person was there, and very similar in appearance to the men that he had met, at the university, that they had been there before him, and then later they came back, and he actually met him the second time.
Well, I just wonder what the chances of someone just dressing up as a Man in Black would be for something like that, Yeah,
well, it shook him up pretty bad. What he said was that whoever these people were, they knew his movements, and they threatened his family, and they knew a lot of information about him, more than just the average Joe. So that was why he took it real serious, and.
Okay.
But in the book, there was I do have an interview with a William Kent Center from Burlington, North Carolina, who was willing to talk about his hair-raising experience a few years back when he was investigating a cattle mutilation case. And I think there were 3 deputies there, and a farmer who was very upset at the loss of one of his prize cows. And then he said 2 days later he had a visit from 3 men in black. And when he describes their appearance and what happened, he really felt that these men in black were alien. I mean, this was a very strange encounter, and even had a little bit of a missing time involved with it. And he actually had a little mobile home there that he was working in this day, and when this happened, and he had different rentals of other mobile homes and an apartment that and it wasn't unusual for a police car to pull up, and so he assumed it was a police car that had pulled up, and he was getting ready to greet these people, and in walked, first of all, there was a very tall 7-8 foot, very, very thin, very very pale, almost clear looking skin, almost transparent looking, with the dark glasses on, the fedora hat, and then behind it was this little short guy. He ended up calling him Shorty, and he said none of them had any facial hair, and even eyebrows, and there was no hair around their hats. And this Shorty guy, well, he came in second, and then the guy behind him, the third guy, was again this very tall, 7-8 foot tall, real thin, strange looking dude who was identical to the first one. And he said Shorty was the only one who did all the talking, and he was ranting on, telling him that he didn't need to do any further investigations of the mutilation case, to stay away from there. And as soon as they walked in the door of the first one, I forgot to tell this, there was almost like this electric type sensation in his body around the stomach area. And that was when he knew that something strange was going on at this point. And he said that one of the first guy that came in, the tall one, he kind of moved around to his left side, and he could kind of see him in his peripheral vision. But this shorty got up in his face and was ranting, and he got the feeling that he could read his mind, that there was a mental connection going on between them, that he kept telling him, take off your glasses, take off your glasses. He wanted to see their eyes because he thought these didn't look like ordinary people, you know. So eventually he says he ripped off his glasses, and he said that he was, what he saw really, really startled him. It was perfectly round, bigger than silver dollars, and it had the brightest blue he'd ever seen. Hardly any white surrounding it. It was, just around the outer edge with a dark black pupil, large black pupil in the center. And then when they suddenly left, he thought it had only been about 5 minutes. And he found himself staring at a front wall, and he didn't even remember turning his desk and looking at the wall. He found that it was actually 25 minutes. He wanted to get up and get the license plate number of the car, but he was still in kind of like a paralyzed condition, couldn't move at first. When he did finally get up, he checked his VHF recorder from his investigation at the mute site, and or the mutilation site, I should say, in case anybody doesn't know what I meant by mute. And he said the tape was gone. The guy that had gone around to his left side, been sneaking around there, obviously had located his VHS recorder and removed the evidence tape that he had. And so that was his story. He's one that got into the field because from early childhood he had had several UFO encounters, and so he's one of these people that I think was wired that way. And he was telling me about George Fawcett. He had started working with him. George Fawcett was living in North Carolina at the time, and they worked together. And George Fawcett told him about having MIB encounters himself. And so I told him a story that I had met George Fawcett at a talk he was given in Massachusetts back in the 70s, and how George Fawcett told a story there of an MIB encounter, and that was one he wasn't even familiar with, and so anyway, that was intriguing. Some of the stories the MIB experiences have is where it's what Jenny Randalls of England called the Oz effect, and she came up with that term back in the 70s. And suddenly, you encounter these beings or these MIBs or a craft, and but in this case, MIBs, and you may be in a shopping mall, in a big parking lot, which is usually overflowing with people, and suddenly you're the only one there, you and these beings. And in a Canadian case, which is also in the same chapter in my book, that was researched by a fellow researcher I knew up in Canada, he described this young man who had seen these two MIB characters, and they walked out. Suddenly it was like there were hardly anybody around, and they walked across this field, and it was raining, and it was a place where a building had been torn down. Another building was going to be placed there, but it was a muddy ground at the time. And he went out after they had walked across it and disappeared, and there was no sign of their footprints.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course we have that, and and a lot of strange alien encounters and apparitions, ghosts, just more connections of weirdness, I guess you could say.
Yeah. How many do you think, when people have Men in Black encounters, do you think that they're actually government people or something like that?
Well, that might be, some of them that would be that. And of course, there was one I mentioned who was actually described in Keel's one of Keel's books about a case out in Minnesota. This lady was visited by this guy. He gave his name, and he was sort of, said he was with the Air Force. Gave his, and yet he acted real strange. He was trying to drink some Jello. He didn't know how to handle Jello. He'd claimed with an upset stomach.
Right.
And turns out there was a guy with this very name who, when Stephen Greer was having those meetings in Washington to disclosure, he was one of the people. The guy with the same name claimed that he was had been acting as a disinformation agent for the Air Force. So just maybe they kind of following the rules of the MIB. Say, well, it works for them. We'll just get out here and do some peculiar stuff and cause a little more confusion, a little more disinformation.
Right.
So it's hard to say. But when you have somebody like, if some of these people describing the information, that the way that these things happen, it's I don't know. It's pretty peculiar. Keel even claimed that he had a visit from the MIB. He told Brad Steiger, I think back in '67, of how they just seemed to walk through his apartment door and into his apartment. Then to prove that they were alien, they drank Lysol. That would do it for me.
Yeah. And do you think that it's? I mean, what do you make of them? Where would you classify the Men in Black? Would you classify them as the same thing as the intelligence behind the phenomena, or would you think there's something else?
I think they're connected somehow at a deep level. There was, Keel had pointed out how Al Greenfield had pointed out early on the similarities to Men in Black figures who supposedly the devil or demons who would appear to people involved in the witchcraft and other movements, that other fields that are where these things are reported. Even people looking into, say, the John Kennedy assassination or Abraham Lincoln. Keel was, I didn't put that in my book, but he was describing some things that he had researched and stories he had heard that he said would curl your hair. The stories of the international bankers and somebody from behind the scenes who's actually controlling world events. There was rumors in the about somebody in the East who, some like king who lived secluded from the rest of the world, but he had great power and could. This is described in this book, The Eighth Tower. Legends of people like this who actually were able to manipulate a lot of events, and it's not really the people we see in the news that are the kings and the presidents and so on, but the real operatives we don't really see, the real manipulators. But that's such, that's the conspiracy stuff there. It gets pretty bad. Don't know what a lot of that's just too deep for me.
I love The Eighth Tower. That might be my favorite book he's written, honestly.
Yeah, that was a very good one.
And it's very obscure for his stuff too.
And a lot of times when he'd write a book, he'd write so much material in it. Like his first book, Operation Trojan Horse, was actually there was a lot more to it, and the editor felt, the publisher just, this is too much, so they chopped it up. And so he had to create another book from the first book, so that's where Strange Creatures from Time and Space came. And I think The Eighth Tower, that was part of another book too, but anyway, thank goodness he became more of a writer than a magician. Gave us a lot to think about.
Yeah, definitely. He talks about lightning strikes and people being killed by lightning also being approximate to this phenomena.
Yeah, he had one of the procedures he would, his investigations when he was traveling through different states, he would visit police stations in areas where there had been a lot of sightings, and he felt that was more the appropriate place to stop than stopping at a newspaper office. And he would have a list of what he called peculiar questions. And one of them was, has anyone been killed by lightning here lately? And he said, sometimes he'd get a response like, my God, how'd you know, just a few weeks ago. And he said, being struck by lightning is not something that happens every day. But he said one time he went to a police station in Ohio, and they were just bringing in a body of a person who had been struck by lightning. And he said that something electrical seems to be happening in these areas, something peculiar electrical. And I didn't know quite what he was interested in. I know that back in 1970, I had written to him about this guy who named Earl Whitney in Augusta, Maine, who was a deputy sheriff and a World War II vet, and he had been killed by a lightning bolt at the Augusta Country Club where he was working. And I wrote to Keel how this man had different UFO experiences he described. One time in 1945, he claimed he and another person saw a UFO land, a disc-shaped object at Waterville near an airport. And another time he was at a fish hatchery, and there was a dome disc that rose up from a field back in 1965. And so he was an experiencer, and Keel was extremely interested in this and put it in his Anomaly newsletter back in July 1970. I wasn't sure at first why he was so interested. He just said there was a lot of funny lightning. But one case that I noticed he had an extreme interest in was one that happened back on January 1st of 1969 in Key West, Florida. This young girl and boy were parking behind a supermarket at night in a station wagon, and I'm sure we can guess what was going on there. But suddenly there was this deep, hollow noise, and they looked out. They were in the front seat, and they looked out and up, and there was this like a long tunnel of light shining down on them, and there were these slow-moving needle-like pieces that were hitting the windshield and the front portion of the roof above them, and this is where it starts really getting weird. They felt like they were in a weightless state. They felt like a pull at their solar plexus area, and it seemed to pull up inside them, upwards through their chest and to the top of their heads. And they felt they couldn't move. There was like a warmth, a tingling warmth, and their eyes started just on their own, just looking up into this tunnel, and they could see this brilliant silver-hued object like out in deep space. And they clasped their hands together, and suddenly it was like a deep freeze. They couldn't let go. And in the beginning, they tried to start the the car, but it wouldn't start. And afterwards, there were like small pittings on the car, on the windshield and on the hood there. And both of their hands showed the effects of where they had unclasped eventually. There was like on a thumb, and one of them had a thumb that had a little blood on it where there was kind of a break in the skin, as well as the other one. There was an investigator named Joseph Yule who was working, I think, with a local newspaper, and he also was corresponding with John Keel. And he also was in touch with my friend Ramona. And according to Yule, he visited the young man, and his mother afterwards said that he was doing suddenly much, much better in school, and was even being offered a scholarship for electronics and his work in mathematics. And his girlfriend, who had always been an E and F student, he said was now an A and B student. Suddenly their IQs were just shooting up. And Yule had noticed that people were seeing UFOs. His neighbors were reporting UFOs over his house. And so when I read about this in a magazine out of St. Petersburg, Florida, called Saucer Scoop, I wrote to Keel to find out what was going on and with the case, and he wrote me on May 27th, 1970, that there has been no additional information on the Key West incident. The investigator, Joseph Yule, had a narrow escape last spring when a bolt of lightning destroyed his study as he was typing a report to me. I haven't heard from him since. And I found out from Ramona that he had felt this like overwhelming compulsion to leave the study. And just as he ran out the door, a lightning bolt demolished his study right behind him, destroyed everything. And, it was like, it was like one of those moments, what is going on here? It almost all seemed like if it hadn't been for that premonition he had, he would have been toast. And I think at this point, there was a John Burke, and he wrote this book called Seed of Knowledge, Stone of Plenty. And Keel had written how a lot of these areas seem to have geomagnetic anomalies associated with them. And he recommended people get like these magnetic or aeromagnetic survey maps from the U.S. Geological Survey and locate these locations, because he felt there were certain hot spots, window areas, and that ancient people were also aware of these. That many times a lot of these lights that we see and they seem to appear in certain areas he called windows were where these geomagnetic anomalies were located. And so anyway, this Burke, actually, I feel like he nailed it. He was an inventor, and I say was because a few years ago he passed away. He had a university background in physics and from Sunny Stonebrook, and he used a fluxgate magnetometer and electrostatic voltmeter and ground electrodes to do his readings. Very expensive equipment. He started over in England with Nancy Talbot back around 1990. And he originally was just interested in seeing if the crop circles produced any unusual readings, when he noticed that a lot of these ancient sites, again and again, had these high-level magnetic readings. And so, he was actually confirming what Keel was saying. He, in the long run, he trekked across the United States from one end to the other. He even went down into Central America. And one of the strongest areas he found was a 17-mile-long mesa of volcanic rock It's what's called the Petroglyph National Monument. It has thousands of these stone carvings left by ancient Native Americans. It's located near Albuquerque. And he told me in an interview I did with him that he said, I measured very powerful, extremely odd surges of electric current in the ground there. It's one of the strongest ones he had ever encountered. Said when the ranger at the visitor center heard what I was finding, she said, periodically I get these new age types coming in here and telling me they just love to sit up in the rocks and feel the energy. I thought they were a bunch of flakes, but you're telling me there might be something to this. And my wife and I went out there about 2007, maybe 2006, and we went to part of this site with a lady who claimed to have had UFO encounters since childhood, and also has had a grandmother who was Apache Indian and taught her some about shamanic ways, medicine ways, and while we were walking up this mesa, she claimed to have gotten an electric shock. When we were we crossed over into Colorado with her, and she took us to a place that she said as a child she had found that it was like a portal area, that there were these, they called them priests, tall priest figures, dark figures who would walk around around this volcanic site there. And these discs would fly along, and they'd actually fly into the side of the volcano like it was just a cloud instead of solid rock. And she put me in touch with another lady who was also following the medicine path, who grew up in the same town, and described having experiences at an early age there as well. And it was quite interesting. She described how she'd had this experience with this, at first like an orb of blue light, and then it became this being. And afterwards, she felt all this energy, and she developed this this thing that I find some more than usual number of experiences have this thing called synthesia. Mm-hmm. It's multiple sensing, where you might smell something, and suddenly you get this intense effect of maybe a visual color or something. And so anyway, in her case, she found that she could tell from her multiple senses, she'd get an impression of something that was going on, and with her synesthesia, and she would know this is there's a say a coyote out on a ridge nearby, and this and that. Just pick up different information from these multiple senses, more than where it was sort of a psychic thing.
Right.
And with near-death experiences, this synesthesia thing seems quite common. So there's a brain change that occurs, well, like with the near-death experience, and I'd say with experiences at certain sites or certain where people feel they've had a certain encounter at these sites. So much to study, and learn.
Yeah, and I think as I've been going through this, I think I mentioned earlier, poltergeist activity is one of the things I see through all this stuff, but electricity is another one. That's just like all of these things seem to have something to do with electricity and lights. And I mean, lights and electricity are kind of obviously connected, I would think, but those three things seem to move no matter what you're talking about. Someone sees Bigfoot and they'll say, like Timothy Renner got to the point where he's asking everyone at a Bigfoot encounter, did you see any weird lights, either during the encounter or in that area at some other time? And they'd be like, well, yeah, actually, it's one of those things that follows through. So the lightning thing doesn't surprise me. And there seems to be obviously certain areas of the earth that are more sensitive to this stuff. What was the thing I was going to mention here? And the idea of you mentioned Andrew Collins a bunch of times in your book. The idea that these things could be plasma intelligence has always fascinated me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and then of course, Rosemary Guiley, she felt that she perceived from her research into paranormal encounters, ghost encounters, and even alien abductions that there was a lot of similarity to this and reports of the Muslim jinn, which a lot of people feel are like these plasma type beings.
Right.
And it and not only her, but also there was Anne Druffel of Los Angeles, well-known researcher who's studied this stuff since the late 50s. And then there was Gordon Crichton, who was the editor of England's Flying Saucer Review. Many of them saw similarity as well, but Rosemary took it to, I think, a deeper level than anybody else that I know of. She actually used the ghost box to, the Frank's box to communicate with the jinn, and she felt that they had fallen below the radar. That a lot of people who thought they were just dealing with ghosts, the shadow people. She said she found that a lot of people describing alien abductions, when she would interview them, they would also tell about the shadow people, and a lot of the antics, the things that occurred in those experiences, were also very common to the jinn experience. So she began to make that connection and correlate it with hundreds of cases that she, was from interviews and cases that had been documented.
Yeah, and I don't know. I feel like putting the jinn on it, though, just kind of is just another name for something we don't understand. Like it's just like you can say it's the fae folk or the jinn or whatever, but it still doesn't really tell us what they are.
Yeah, she, I kind of brought that up in an interview with her. That's in the book, that Keel felt that way. That it was they go by many different names, and who could say? But she felt he was wrong. But she said, then again, on the other hand, maybe the jinn are like us. Maybe they're being manipulated too. Maybe it's just another. I know Paul Eno has a similar idea that maybe some of these little people and whatnot, maybe they're part of the multiverse out there, and in their world, they're being plagued by these same trickster type forces or whatever.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And you mentioned, of course, with the Bigfoot. I had found a number of cases where, there was strange lights involved with that. I was called in to a case back in April of '77. Guy on Long Island I'm not sure how we got in contact now, but we got to talking on the phone, and he wanted to know if I wanted to come down from Maine down to New Jersey, because back then I was crazy and did a lot of traveling. And so they said they had a lot of sightings down there, and I could stay with this couple that could pick me up for a few days, and they knew the witnesses and could go around and investigate. And one of them was a young man who was a repeater, who had other experiences. But this one particular one had just happened a couple months before I got there. And he said he was out walking and he heard footsteps behind him. It was at night. And he turned around and was face to face with a Bigfoot. He said, I think he had a flashlight and shined it in the Bigfoot's eyes. And he said that all of a sudden it was like 18 inches distance from face to face. And then behind the Bigfoot, a few feet behind it, was this little small pinpoint of light, but it was producing this high-pitched whistle-type noise. And he said, we just stood there looking at each other, and it looked like neither one of us could move until after a few seconds, the light just extinguished, and so did the sound. And then he said the Bigfoot turned around and went the other way, and he continued on his way home. But yeah, I'd heard a number of stories in Flintville, Tennessee, back in '76. There was a row of houses on this little lane where you could stop at any house there, and they would tell you about their Bigfoot encounters. This one guy, he says, I don't know what they are. I don't know the Bigfoot or some kind of mutation of nature, but he said, whenever this thing is around, we see these balls of light just over the pine trees here. And there was a guy from New York who came down, and he had some strange experiences out there prowling around. He had previously been to Loch Ness and spent quite a bit of time there investigating that. And he wrote up his article. I can't remember what magazine it was, but I got to meet him for a bit. And, he said, why don't you stay the night? And I says, nah, I gotta get back to Waynesboro. And wouldn't you know it, the night I go back to Waynesboro, that's when all the weird stuff happened to him. But
sure,
that's the story. That's the story of my life,
Huh.
But Nick Redfern wrote an interesting article in mysteriousuniverse.org about a place in East Texas, Piney Woods. 83,000 acre woodland called the Big Thicket, and there's a ghost light nearby that appears along this Bragg Road. But apparently there's been people seeing like large cats and Bigfoots that suddenly turn into like a small bright globe of light. And there was one lady, he was there in 2007, who was a wildlife officer, and she told Redfern that she had seen this big cat that was taking a drink out of a little pond, and then it turned and looked at her, and suddenly it turned into this glowing ball of light and seemed to melt into the pool of water, which suddenly steam was rising out of. Now that's a strange one right there.
Yeah. Huh.
And there was one story of a 8-foot Bigfoot that there was a flash, then there was a golf ball sized globe of light. Hovered about 20, 30 seconds, then it fizzled out to the sound of electrical type sound crackling, which was similar to a sound that had been described to me in Brooksville, Florida by a Bigfoot witness who got chased into her house through the front door by a Bigfoot one day.
Wow.
And she said there was this weird crackling sound overhead. And she said later, about 3 weeks later, there was her daughter-in-law that heard a similar sound over her house. And she, Brooksville, Florida, back in the 60s and 70s was a very active UFO and Bigfoot area. And that was where good friend of, my friend Ramona actually went over there to live back in the 70s. And that's when she met up with a gentleman by the name of Dwayne, and she married him. And they were investigating a ranch over there where they had both seen Bigfoot themselves, and then she had an encounter alone herself, and said this ranch was also area of a lot of UFO activity. Dwayne had gone out at the end of the driveway one evening, and a large craft with lighted square windows just low overhead flew over his head. And there was Ramona showed me a stretch of road nearby where she had 2-lane road, and this big ball of light, she said, came down out of the sky, touched down the road in front of her, and then bounced back up. So, and of course, yet the cryptozoologist still thinks it's just a biological creature. I don't know.
Well, we're just about out of time. The book is John A. Keel, The Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing Mysteries. You are Brent Raynes, and where can people find you online?
Well, apmagazine.info is my website. That's where each issue of our alternate perceptions will appear at the first of each month. And at the end of the month, when we put a new issue in, we'll go ahead and archive the previous issues. So we've got several years of archive materials for anyone who wants to read the current issue and then maybe check out some of the contents of previous issues. We always have interview features and book reviews and various feature articles, and then more articles, and also links to what we think are significant news items out there.
Okay. All right. And how many other books do you have other than this?
I have 2 other books that I've written. In my first one was Visitors from Hidden Realms in 2004, and then 2009, On the Edge of Reality. And then I've got a number of books that Tim Beckley of Inner Vision had asked me to put in a chapter for, along with some other authors. So,
any plans for what's next?
Well, I'm thinking about maybe following up with another one, exploring some of this Keelian stuff a little further.
Nice. Yeah, I highly recommend this book. It's very well written. It's very interesting, and there's a lot of different information in there. Not just, as we said at the beginning, not just Keel, but expansion on some of the things Keel brings up. So definitely worth reading, and I'm really glad you wrote it.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad I did too. Appreciate it, Seriah.
And I'm going to take a moment to give a shout out to my Patreons. All of you are awesome, and you help make this a thing, make it real. And for those of you pledging $10 or more, a special shout out to Allison Cook, Eric Hervin, Super Inframan, Tim, Rob Drummond, Alex Whitcomb, Nadine, Damian Tallman, Edu Kamahort, Elliot Keegan, Janet Bunderson, 36 Dingo, Maria, Nate Seriah, Jennifer Campbell, American Rambler, Kevin, John Rutledge Foster, Eric Citron, Andy McNamara, Sasha Jorg, Matthias Sunby, Christopher Vaughn, Riker and Stark, Sean Cosgrove, Jose A., Roger Gonzalez, Craig Cisternos, Ray Benedetto, Lindsay Jackson K., Alfred Tuttle, Kevin Schreck, Patricia Giaquinta, William Lovelace, Mark Brady, Chris is a hot dog a sandwich, and Carla Mahoney. I thank you all so very much. All right, and I will have another part with Brent coming up in a few weeks, and I'll also be interviewed by him on his AP Magazine site. I think that's going to be put up on December 1st, I think he said. I'll link to that when that comes out on the Facebook page and stuff like that. We did do a Patreon segment with Brent, and we talk about a weird portal experience that was related to him that was very, very strange, and go on from there for a little bit. But yes, Brent will be back, so I hope you enjoyed that, and yeah. And we'll see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.